Shiur and Shmooze, take 10. So first of all, thank you Elliot for once again a lovely wall department. Thank you Joel for a virgin schmoozer and Shiur. Today the Tzedkah is going to go to...
it's the Israeli Multiple Sclerosis Society. My mother, who lives here, has multiple sclerosis, has had it for many years, so it's a topic that is close to my heart. I also know many other people who have been affected by it, either personally or via relatives. There's a lot of MS research done in Israel, and also there's a lot of people living with MS in Israel, so it's a charity that's close to my heart. And Yonah just checked the website, which I hadn't actually been on recently, and said that they're also, if anybody's interested, selling Haggadot for 40 shekels, you said, right? For 40 shekels, so that could be another way that you can contribute as well. So that's the tzedakah today.
And once again, thank you, Yonah, for recording. And ask me about Romeo and Juliet.
Ask me about them, they all die in the end.
Gotta come and leave it. Just tell us the
I'm worried about Hamilton.
All right, so thanks everybody, welcome, thank you for coming. I'm excited to be giving this talk. I actually gave it once before on Shavuot at my house. Every year on Shavuot I do a learning thing at my house, and I then have revised and expanded it a bit for now. It's a lot of stuff, so I'm going to try to get through everything. So I think what I'll do is, if people have questions, I'd rather wait till the end for that. Basically I'm going to be approaching this topic, the idea of the custom that many Jews have of going to the graves of holy people, be it rabbis or biblical figures or the avot and imahot. This custom, is this actually a Jewish custom, and what are the issues surrounding it? So I come to this basically because I'm a tour guide, as many or most of you or perhaps all of you know. So I'm a tour guide, and it's a topic that therefore comes up. There's a lot of people who want to visit graves. There are some people who come here and that's all they want to do, is go from what we call kever hopping, just go from one to the next to the next. If they ask me for that, I tell them I'm not the guide for them. I'm happy to take somebody if it's in the context of something else, but so this is a topic that does come up to me, and I think that all of us will recognize, no matter what, that it certainly is a practice that has changed a lot over time, and I'll give you just a little example that came up today. So my sister-in-law, who knows I was giving this talk, sends me a text this morning that she received a recorded call this morning from the kever of Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. and it was ishi, it was a personal call, and I'm wondering, because I believe I've received the same call. Right, so I'm wondering how it could be ishi if it's actually, we're all getting the same call, but how did it get from where it was to what it is now? And that's part of what I'll be exploring in today, is how did it get from the original, whatever it was, to people getting these calls, recorded calls from a grave. So just as by show of hands, can you just raise your hand, how many of you have prayed at the grave of a holy Jewish person? Okay? Of you, so raise your hand if you were at Marat Machpelah, Kever Rachel. What about other biblical figures like prophets, things like that? And what about rabbis, people who are not biblical figures? Okay, so a lot of all of those things. Some none and some of those. All right.
I've not been to any nuns.
So,
those are the fun ones.
I'm going to ask a few questions here that I hope to answer over the course of this. So first of all, is this in its origins a Jewish custom? Has the custom changed over time? Is this something that we as Jews should be doing? And if so, are there differences between the different types of graves? And finally, what I'll get to is, if we do decide that we want to go visit such graves, what else might we do there if we're not just going there to pray? Okay, so up front, I'm going to do something that I wouldn't normally do, is I'm going to give you up front what my end result is, which is that I'm against the custom, personally. Okay? This does not mean that I'm going to tell you that it's asur, that anybody who does it is, is going to hell, or that even that they're doing things that are contrary to Jewish beliefs. I believe that anybody who has the desire to go and pray at a kever tzaddik has a million poskim that they can rely on that say that this is permissible, if not encouraged. So therefore, knowing that it is such a mainstream practice and that there are so many people that believe this and there are so many poskim in favor of this, I'm not going to be focusing on that. That doesn't mean they don't exist. I'm simply going to be providing the counterbalance, which is the arguments why the other side exists and why I think that it's not something that we should be doing. But that is not to convince any of you not to do it. If anybody wants to do it, gesundheit, and the idea hopefully is just for all of us, whether you do it or not, to gain a deeper understanding of the issues surrounding it and the history of it, etc. So the way I'm going to be doing this is I'm going to be basically making three major arguments. One will be a historical argument, one which will touch briefly on things like archaeology as well as a little bit of sociology, not much. One will be a both halakhic and a philosophical argument, and one will be a practical argument. Okay, and so there's a lot to cover. By the way, a few people asked about source sheets. I will be quoting many sources, but most of them are one or two sentences, and so I didn't feel it was worth printing them all up. I will be quoting them in English. If anybody would like the sources at the end, I'm happy to give them to you, send them to you, etc., the full list of them. Okay, so let me start with the history. And I'll start with the question, did early Jews, the original Jews, the ancient Jews, did they visit graves, particularly to pray there? And if so, what types and what did they do there? So I'll begin that in Tanakh, in the entire Tanakh, there is no reference to anybody going to pray at a kever that I'm aware of. Okay? There is no reference of that. Now some of you may be already asking a question, which I'll address in a moment, which is the story of our friend's namesake, Kalev. Okay, so I'll get to that in a few moments, but nowhere in Tanakh does it say that anyone went to visit a grave and pray there. And I believe this is actually fairly logical. Okay? In the times when Jews cared about issues of tumah and tahara, of ritual impurity, unlike today where we are all, according to the rabbinate, we are all considered tumat mate, that we already are all impure, ritually considered to have touched dead people, etc. It's not an issue. We don't have para aduma anymore. But in times when there was, going to visit a grave, even of a relative, would be quite an elaborate thing that you had to deal with. And so it's not really very logical that back then, when people cared about it, people would go to graves on a frequent or willy-nilly basis. And by the way, this doesn't end in the year 70 when the temple was destroyed. I don't know how many of you know this, but the Mei Tahara, the water of the Para Aduma ashes, according to, at least from references in the Talmud, lasted hundreds of years after the destruction of the temple. Okay, there's references both in Niddah and 6b and Chagiga 25a, where there's a rabbi named Ula who talks about the fact that at the time of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, which is basically 2nd and 3rd century, they kept the laws of ritual purity from Tumat Mei in the Galilee. That they had, this suggests that they still had the Mei Tahara. So this is hundreds of years after the destruction of the temple. And so, while this is still in existence, I don't think people would be regularly visiting graves. Thus, it seems to suggest to me that praying at Kivrei Tzadikim is seemingly not an ancient Jewish practice, meaning the earliest Jewish practices. Okay? Even the Byzantine era is still ancient, but I mean of the earliest Jews. Archaeologically, when we see things in the 1st and 2nd centuries, we find tombs. For example, in Jerusalem, to the north of Shar Shechem, there is an area called the Tombs of the Kings. It used to be believed that it was some of the kings of Judea, that it was later determined that it was probably Queen Helene. Outside of the tomb itself, outside of the burial cave, there's a separate room that was like basically a sitting area. Okay? And similarly, if you go to Chibet Burgen, which is in the Shvela, from the 2nd century, we find other graves there, burial caves with a sitting area outside. Presumably, this does not mean that people were going on a frequent basis all the time to be praying or things like that. This was probably for the relatives of the dead. And in fact, interestingly, some of them had a mikvah right next to them as well, so they could at least immerse afterwards when they were done. Also remember that Jews buried outside of their cities. They had burial caves outside, but they would keep them nearby, right? If you look at like Jerusalem, right, the ancient city of Jerusalem, Ir David, right across the valley at the bottom of the Mount of Olives, there are graves. Why are they so close to the city? It's possible just because they don't want to have to walk far, but it's also possible that they probably did go to visit their relatives' graves, and therefore they're burying them outside the city, but they want to at least keep them close enough that they can go visit. The first mentions that we have of people praying at Kivrei Tzaddikim, at least the first one I'm aware of, is in the Talmud. In the Talmud Bavli, which is dated to the year 500 is when it's codified. And it's referencing something in the Bible. This is what I was referring to before. It says that when Kalev is entering the land of Israel with the Meraglim, with the spies, he goes to Marat HaMachpelah, and he prays to the Avot and the Imahot to save him from being persuaded by the plans of the Meraglim. This is the first mention that I know of any Jew going to pray at a Kever Tzaddik. It's in Sotah and 34b.
Does it say in the Bible? I think it's only in
Rashi is much later, and so Rashi is quoted from the Talmud.
So it's Talmudic, okay.
It's Talmudic source. So Talmud is before Rashi. So if it's mentioned in Sotah, then that's before. Sefer HaYashar, which is actually later, just putting it in the same category, talks also, it's Ibn Ezra in the 12th century, talks about Yosef, when he's sold into slavery on his way down to Mitzrayim, he runs away from his captors to run to Kever Rachel and pray for her assistance before he's taken down.
What does that say?
It's a source called Sefer HaYashar. This is the Ibn Ezra in the 12th century. And there's one outlier, sort of weird, a bit weird story in the Talmud as well, Taanit 23b, where it talks about Rav Mani. Rav Mani is being oppressed by people, and he's all worried, and so he runs to his father's grave, which is Rav Yonah, and he prostrates himself on the grave and prays to his father to help him against his people, and then Rav Yonah performs a miracle, and their feet get stuck to his grave until they agree to stop oppressing him. What do we see is true of all of these examples that I've given? Does anybody see a common denominator between these examples I've given? Kalev going to Marat HaMachpelah, Yosef going to Kever Rachel, Rav Mani going to his father's tomb, the sitting areas outside of the tombs that I mentioned.
They all want help.
Perhaps. I mean, going to visit their relatives' graves.
What was the reason that they went?
Okay, there's a reason.
Is it a personal relationship with the...
I think that's the case. I think that the earliest ones we see are all either direct relatives, like people going to their father, things like that, or the Avot and Imahot, which are all of our father and mother. Okay? So all of these examples, and Yosef going to Kever Rachel, all of them are people going to visit their direct relatives or their ancient relatives. Okay? So something which apparently was not an ancient Jewish practice begins to crop up in a limited form in the 5th to 6th centuries. And so, if it's not an ancient Jewish custom originally, where does this come from? And that's the big question. And it's one of the things that to me makes it problematic. It's not a widespread practice in most other ancient cultures either. Okay? There's not a lot of ancient cultures that we hear about people praying at gravesides. In fact, in many pagan cultures, such as Rome, for example, most of them burned their dead. So certainly they couldn't go and pray by a kever because there was no kever. Many people attribute the source of this custom to Christianity. Why to Christianity? Where does it come from in Christianity? Well, for the first few hundred years that Christianity exists. Remember, Christianity is born probably around the year 33. According to tradition, Jesus is killed at the age of 33. From that point until the Byzantine period begins in the beginning of the 4th century, it is illegal, basically, in most times in Rome to be Christian. For much of the time you're living in Rome, if you are caught as a Christian, you can be killed. And so Christianity is practiced in secret. Often it's practiced in what are called domus ecclesia, a house church, a secret church inside of a house. But also we have evidence that they used to go into the catacombs, which is where they used to bury their dead, because they didn't burn their dead, and they didn't have money to buy big burial plots, so that's why they dug catacombs. And they would go in there and they would pray in there. Once they were there already, then you figure, okay, so we're praying amongst the dead, at least let's find the saintly people and let's pray next to them. There's evidence also of small churches. There's one named St. Agnes. I haven't been to the catacombs in Rome, but I was reading about them. That there's a small church underground. Now there's a big church above it, but underground in the catacombs there was a church there. And they also would hold more memorial services and celebrations for Christian martyrs in the catacombs. So this can be the beginning of it. And then, once the Byzantine period begins and Christianity becomes legal, Queen Helena comes to the land of Israel and builds 4 churches. One of those 4, of course, is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So one of the first original churches is a church dedicated to a tomb, to the burial spot of Jesus. And so it is very conceivable that from Christian culture, as the dominant culture under which the Jews were living, this bubbled into our culture. And this is not an isolated case. We have other examples of this. For example, many shuls that we find in Israel from the Byzantine period have mosaics on the floor with human figuration, pictures of people, which in ancient times nobody did in Jewish art, because that was considered to be creating a graven image against the Aseret Dibrot. You also even have in there like zodiac signs and Helios, the sun god, and all these things. And it wasn't that they were worshiping Helios or something like that. It was just that this was part of the general overall culture of the society they lived in. They're like, okay, we don't believe in Helios, but it's a symbol of our belief in God doing these things for us, or something like that. A later example. How many people do you know, or how many among you have a chamsa, right? It's a good luck charm, but where does it come from? It originates in Arab culture, okay, in Muslim culture. It comes to us, and now, actually, very interestingly, if you guys go into the Christian Quarter, you can find a chamsa with Christian symbols on it, which is a great example of this passing from Muslim culture into Judaism, bringing it to Israel via Jews, and then to the Christians who are living here under Jewish culture. We're seeing it transferred to all 3 of the religions, very interestingly. But the idea is that these things happen. The idea of culture, the dominant culture affecting the minority culture, which is what Judaism was. So you may raise a question then, and I think it's a valid question, which is, what about these examples that we have? It's in the Talmud Bavli. Bavel was never under the Byzantine Empire. And it's a valid question. The only response that I can give is that the year 500 is already nearly 200 years after Byzantine Empire reaches Jerusalem, and thus 200 years with intercourse between Jews here and Jews there, and relationships, it's very possible that by then it was seen as an old Jewish custom. 200 years is a long time. Okay, so possibly. I don't know, but that's a possibility. Alternatively, one might say, remember that the only major reference in the Talmud is to Ma'arat HaMachpelah, and it's very possible, my brother's a rabbi, and I've discussed this topic with him. He likes to say that very possibly Ma'arat HaMachpelah is the exception that proves the rule. That they said Ma'arat HaMachpelah is different. It's our forefathers, and going to them is one thing. It doesn't mean that you should be going to all Kivrei Tzaddikim or whatever, but going to our forefathers, there's a different status there. And perhaps they considered it acceptable there, even though they may not have considered it to be a real Jewish practice. If it's a quick question, I want to say it to the end.
I've heard some comments that there's even a heter for Kohanim, according to some, to go to Maharam Schick OC.
Sure. There's, yeah, okay. So let's get back to the historical development and see how it changed even from that time. So we've gotten to the point where there was no history of it to where there's the beginning of it. Let's see how it expands. It becomes a much more widespread custom during the Middle Ages, and primarily the reason for that is that Jews in Israel at that time didn't have access to Jewish holy sites. So really the only places that they could go were Kivrei Tzaddikim. And the way we know that this increased, and that it started first with biblical figures and then Tanaim and Amoraim, is that we have many travelers who came through here in the Middle Ages and recorded things, and they recorded lists of kvarim, or kvarim, kvarot, I always forget. Kvarot?
You can say both.
Both? Okay, good. Kvarim or kvarot that were here. For example, Benjamin Metudel, you may have heard of in 1170, the Historia Farchi in 1322, others, they list these things. So we know that this has become a more widespread tradition. It gets even wider in the 16th century. The 16th century is the golden age of Kabbalah and Tzfat. First of all, what brings the Kabbalists to Tzfat in particular? There are those who say that perhaps it's because of the proximity. You're showing the thread?
Mm.
The proximity to the Kever Rashbi, the Kever of Rav Shimon Bar Yochai in Meron, which is very close to Tzfat.
No, Hashem's wool.
I'm sorry?
Wool is what brought them to Tzfat.
Okay, for business.
Yes. It was
But
the
that
business of
doesn't specify why the Kabbalists in particular went. That's just why Jews came there.
Well, because there was money. They could afford to...
It's also possible. That's what I'm saying is possible. I don't know that it's the reason, but I'm sure they weren't upset that it was near Kever Rashbi. But they greatly expand this process. This is not just going to pray at the tombs of a few of the Tanaim Amoraim. They set up specific prayers and teachings that you're supposed to do when you visit these graves. They used to go visit graves for very long, extended periods, hours upon hours on end, and meditate there. The Arizal, they talk about how he would go to specific kfarim and he would lay down on top of the kever and he would put his arms above the arms of the body and his legs above the legs, and he would be able to commune with the body that was in there. And of course, he's very famous for having gone around and identifying all of these graves based on the spirits that he could sense, that he could say, this is accurately the grave of this rabbi, you thought it was there, but it's actually here. This one, we don't know who it is, but I'm telling you it's this person. That one is wrong when they say it's this. And he has these lists. I'm not going to say that Kabbalistic beliefs and practices are wrong, or that they're nonsense. I'm not saying that. But clearly, for all, it's very clear to see that this was a drastic change from the prior practices that were taking place. And it led to a wide expansion in the practice of praying in Kibbutz Tzaddikim. Okay, that before, perhaps it was biblical figures and a few of the Tanaim and Amoraim, and now it's become much more widespread and much more variety of practices. I think you all agree with that. In fact, there are many within the Hasidic and Kabbalistic community that actually, recognizing the power of praying to tzaddikim, still say that these practices are actually worthless for the average person, only for those who really understand it. The Satmar Rebbe, for example, Rav Yoel Teitelbaum, says that it's only for people who understand these things deeply and not for the regular person, and therefore Satmar Chasidim don't go to Kibbutz Tzaddikim. It's not in their practice. And there are others. Let's take it a step further, which is the modern era. In the modern era, this expands even more. Okay? And in the modern era, you start to get modern times. In the 20th century, people identifying this grave as the grave of somebody. How could they possibly know this? Okay? So many modern identifications, some of them aren't even necessarily what would traditionally be seen as tzaddikim. They're historical figures like Kever Matityahu or the Maccabim. Not to say that they're not tzaddikim, but they're not on the same level or scale or scope or style as many of these others. You'll also find like many lesser known rabbis that people start to flock to their graves. Like for example, I don't know how many of you know this or have been there. Right near the Knesset in the Supreme Court, at the edge of Gan Sacher, there's a cemetery there. Okay, right next to the bird observatory. In that cemetery there is a kever of a Rav. How many of you have heard of Rav Gedaliah Moshe Goldman?
Where's the kever?
It's in a small cemetery at the edge of Gan Sacher.
That's the Chida, isn't it?
I'm sorry, the Chida? No, he's of Shvil Hasidim, which I understand that there are many Shvil Hasidim here in Jerusalem. But when I've been there and I've seen busloads of people that are not all Hasidim coming there, I'm not in any way saying that he wasn't a great rabbi. I have no idea or anything about him, but I think we can all see a difference.
Didn't he have another name though?
I'm sorry?
Didn't he have another name?
Not that I'm aware of. We can look him up later. It's not important at the moment.
Buried there.
Close to the Knesset.
Can you explain
I think the idea though...
why people are buried?
Pardon?
Why is there a cemetery?
For those who are curious, the reason that there's a cemetery there at all was because it was during the War for Independence. We didn't have access to the Mount of Olives, and so they buried there temporarily until they got to Harmon and I believe that possibly all of this expansion, especially in the modern era, to so many, without trying to denigrate, but more minor rabbis, is two things. Partially, I think it stems in part from the Hasidic idea of the veneration of the Rav. Before the Hasidic movement, of course, people respected Rabbanim, but there wasn't this veneration of the Rav to the degree that the Hasidic movement has taken it.
What is veneration?
To like idealize. But I think it also shows that in modern Judaism, in the last 200 years or so, there has been a major loss of spirituality, and people are searching for a way to connect, and they're not finding it elsewhere. And I think that's. I'm not saying that, but I think that that's what happened. And I'll give you one example of how these sort of newer traditions began. Has anybody here ever heard of Rav Leibel Baal HaYesurim? Okay, he's buried in Sfat. My brother told me this story. So my brother went there about 8 to 10 years ago. My brother used to teach at a girls' seminary here in Jerusalem, and he was going to be guiding the girls in the cemetery there, and so he went to prepare. And he's visiting the traditional graves of, Rav Yosef Karo and the Ari and others, and he sees these signs pointing to the grave of Rav Leibel Baal Yisurim. Now, it's a very interesting name. Baal Yisurim means the master of suffering. Okay? And this piques his interest. Who is this person, and how come I've never heard of him? And so he follows the signs all the way to a far side of the cemetery. There's a platform around the kever, and there's a few Hasidim there. And he goes over and he waits for them to finish saying their Tehillim, and he says, "Tell me, who's Rav Levo Bar Yisrael?" Great tzaddik. Who is he? You're supposed to pray here. It's wonderful. They don't know, bottom line. Okay, so no, that's not the end. So he goes back and he goes up. When you come out of the cemetery, there's all these vendors there, and he figures these guys are here all the time. Maybe they know. He asks them. None of them know. One little kid points to some old man who's a vendor, and he says, "If anybody knows, he'll know. Ask him." So my brother goes over to him and says, "Who is Rav Levo Bar Yisrael?" And the guy says, "Klum." Nothing? What do you mean? He says, if you came here 5 years ago, there was nothing. Nobody ever went to see him, nothing. And his descendants wanted to honor the memory of their grandfather, great-grandfather, whatever it was. And so they had some money. They built this big platform and they put up the signs. Okay? And so people started to go, and it began to build. Now, by the way, I don't want to say he may have been an extremely righteous person, and I'm not in any way saying he wasn't, and he may have been a great rabbi. I don't know. Okay? But the point is that people didn't know who he was until they built this and the thing. Now, you can search it online yourselves. I did it myself. And so he's connected with, it turns out he's connected with Lubavitch. That he lived in Hebron and either moved to Tzfat at the end of his life or was only brought there to be buried. They say that he was one of the greatest students of Rav Shneur Zalman, the second rabbi of the Lubavitch, right? He was the second rabbi of the dynasty? One of the early Lubavitch rabbis. I don't remember which one. Was he the first? The first. The founder. Okay? I don't know what it means that he's one of the greatest, but okay. And then it gets to specific things. One of them says that there's a special segula to go to him to pray for a birth. Especially you should go there on Friday afternoon to daven. And that before he died, he said that anyone who has terrible problems should visit his grave.
He said that?
That's what it says now. Okay, so again, I'm not trying to say he wasn't a great person or anything, but we can see how this has progressed. One moment, we'll see how this progressed in the span of 10 years. And I think that this is how some of these things spread. Yes, Khaled?
And do you know where the name comes from, the Bar Yisrael?
I think it's from that last sentence that he said, if you have terrible problems in your life, then you should come to me. Presumably, he had some suffering in his life as well. Nothing that I found, and I didn't do that much research, nothing that I found specifies what that suffering was.
There's a story with the donkey's grave. That's someone.
This is a famous joke. Yeah.
I don't know if the joke is real. I saw a picture, probably fake. That someone's donkey died, and he wrote, "Here died Obi Shimon."
Right.
And people began to pray there, and more people began to come, and became a famous grave to come to.
So, to sum up the historical piece of this, from what I've laid out for you, I do not believe that this was in any way an ancient Jewish practice, and logically it wouldn't have been an ancient Jewish practice due to Tuma and Tara. It began in limited form, probably dealing with avod and maybe relatives during the Byzantine period, potentially via Christian influence. It spread due to a lack of access to other Jewish sites during the Middle Ages. It expanded even further due to the various innovations that the Kabbalist movement brought about. And finally, it expanded in the modern era, possibly due to a combination of the Hasidic influence and the yearning for spiritual connection. And so, at that, I'll say that I don't believe that in its origins it is a Jewish practice. One can certainly say it doesn't matter if it's in its origins a Jewish practice. The things that have, over the years, developed as a Jewish practice, that's Jewish practice, and that's okay. And I have no argument against that. Let's move on to potential problems with davening at Kivrei Tzadikim, both on a halachic basis and on a philosophical basis. And I'll begin with the idea that many people, when they daven at a Kivrei Tzadik, are asking the tzaddik to intervene on their behalf with God, or to pray on their behalf to God. And this potentially is against the idea of Doresh El HaMeitim, which is in Devarim Yudchet, Perek Yud Aleph. Among the Toivot, it says that you're forbidden to be Doresh El HaMeitim, which means one who inquires of the dead. Now, in the traditional view of this, Sanhedrin 56b limits this meaning very specifically to specific types of witchcraft and necromancy. Okay? Not any time talking to the dead, but specific types of witchcraft. And in the 14th century, the Torah, and the 16th century, the Shulchan Aruch, keep with this idea that it's very limited in terms of what it means. But we see it change in the 19th century.
Would that be like, for example, trying to connect with
It
the
talks
grave-
about people like
connect with
sleeping in the graveyard and I don't remember the specifics, but doing all sorts of specific things that are meant to like create a séance of some kind.
Seances and mediums and everything.
Exactly. I won't say any séance, but yes.
In Greece they did that, didn't they? Some Jewish
I'm
women.
sorry, I didn't hear you.
In Greece,
In Greece?
they did that. I think it was some Jewish women.
Certainly possible, yeah. I don't know, but it's
You do
possible.
They slept in the cemetery or something like that. So you-
Jews or?
Jewish
I hadn't heard
women,
about that.
Yeah.
Okay.
But mediums do that all the time.
Right, but
Sleep
that's
in
not a
graveyards?
Jewish
But
practice.
pro mediums do that. I thought,
Sleep in graveyards?
That could be an oxymoron.
no, they talk to the
Oh, okay.
opposite channel.
So this changes somewhat. The mainstream halachic view changes somewhat in the 19th century. You have.
Anyone know what medium is in Hebrew?
Medium.
I don't know. Dorei Shalametim, You can look it up on Morphix later. All right. In the 19th century, we have the Mishnah Brurah, the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, the Maharam Schick. All of them changed and say it's not only this limited style of necromancy; it's anytime you directly address the dead, talking to the dead. This is considered Dorei Shalametim, according to many of these mainstream 19th century halachic poskim. And obviously, when one can say, well, okay, this is a change in the 19th century, you look back at the Shulchan Aruch itself, and you look at the Talmud, and it doesn't say that, so we're still okay, and you have a leg to stand on with that. I think that perhaps the reason it changed in the 19th century is a reaction to how much this practice expanded by the time. What we saw in the historical piece, which that it's changed so much, and maybe they're saying people are going a little bit too far. We need to address this. Interestingly, in the 17th century, the Shaf, he has an interesting explanation. He says it's just talking to the dead is not considered Dorei Shalametim. Why not? Because everybody does it. So if everybody's doing it, it must not be usher. And I think it shows something that we'll see, and it'll come up again. I'll show you another thing like that, where basically, sometimes with the halachic process, when the mainstream Jews are doing something, then they don't want to fight with them. They just say, okay, then
Well, that's
it's all right.
part, I think that's part of human nature. I mean, if you lose your parents, you keep talking to them.
Yeah,
So I don't think you can really not permit people that. So.
yeah. Well, I don't think it means just talking to your parents, but I mean, like if you went to the grave and you're just, and maybe it's different with your parents also. I'm just saying what is potentially an issue. I'm not saying it is straight out usher. Next issue. Rambam, Hilchot Avel 4:13, based on Brachot in 18a, says, quote, a person should not walk within 4 cubits of a grave with tefillin in his hand or a Torah scroll in his arm, nor should he pray there. At a distance of 4 cubits, that's about 6 feet, this is permitted. So according to the Gemara and the Rambam, you're not allowed to pray in a grave. Now I believe this is talking about Shemona Esrei. It's not talking about like you going and whispering your personal prayers or saying Tehillim. But I think it shows something about the mindset, and that potentially you may be violating this halacha as well.
I think the reason is different. The reason is because lag larash, because you're.
That's one of the 2 reasons given. It's not the only reason given.
Anymore.
That's one of the 2 reasons given. It's not the only reason given. But yes. But what are saying you're not supposed to embarrass the dead.
Right.
If they can't learn Torah anymore, and therefore you can. Even if that is the reason, it doesn't matter. The point is that that's the halacha. But you're right. It does come largely from that. The idea of that they can't praise God, so you shouldn't praise God.
That's why the tzitzis you keep in your, you put in your
Exactly.
pocket.
There's a custom of tucking your tzitzit in when you go into a cemetery, for sure.
Well, the Rambam also said you shouldn't build memorials over graves of Tzaddikim and look at Israel.
We'll get to that at the end, but you're right, yes. So potentially you shouldn't be praying in a cemetery at all, according to halacha. Let's deal with philosophy a little bit. And I think that the idea of us going to Kivrei Tzaddikim and praying and stuff like that perpetuates a stress on the dead, whereas Judaism, and I'll give many examples in a few moments, stresses life over death. Okay, let's start from the beginning. What we do on earth when we are alive is valuable in the eyes of Judaism, and that's why in the Garden of Eden, Adam partners with God, and he helps to name the animals and all of these things. And that's where the idea, this Jewish concept of tikkun olam comes from. What's important is what we do while we are alive here on earth. Death imparts tumah, ritual impurity. The high priest, the Kohen Gadol, is not permitted to mourn for his own relatives because the ideas of mourning are contrary to the holiness of the Mikdash. Okay? Vayikra 18:5, v'chai bahem, and you should live by them, which leads us to the idea of pikuach nefesh docha hakol. What does that mean? That means all of the good deeds in the world are not as important as saving a person's life. Life is a supreme value. Okay? We go to Sefer Yeshaya, a beautiful piece of prophecy where it says in Lamed Chet, "For it is not the underworld that praises you, not death that extols you. They who descend into the pit cannot hope for your truth. Only the living can give thanks to you." Saying, the dead can't praise God. Only the living can. The living are the ones who are the important ones. We have to dwell on life, not on death. And I'll move to a modern philosophical view, which is Rav Soloveitchik in Halakhic Man. A few quotes. He says, "Death negates the entire magnificent experience of Halakhic Man," meaning our role here is to do mitzvot. And when you die, you can no longer do mitzvot. Therefore, death negates the entire experience of Halakhic Man. Halacha is devoid of any positive orientation to death and burial. On the contrary, it views these phenomena from a negative perspective. Death is the symbol of the most intense defilement. And then he ends with, "Holiness is rooted and embedded in joy," which you can only have when you're alive. By the way, it makes me think about all the people who go to Uman, when Nachman is, about mitzvah gdol liot b'simcha, right? And then you're going to the death. How can you dwell in the joy? So, philosophically, we value life over death. Doesn't mean we don't respect and value the dead, but we respect the living more. Another philosophical issue, which is that we're supposed to pray directly to God, not use any intermediaries, tzaddikim, angels, anything. A few examples. Devarim 34:6, when Moshe dies, it says that his grave is hidden. And the Midrash Lekach Tov, which is an 11th century Midrash, says that the reason for this was so that his grave wouldn't become a pilgrimage spot for prayer, supplanting the Mikdash. We don't want people to go to his grave to pray. We're supposed to go directly to God. Yerushalmi Brachot. Don't call for help to the angels Michael and Gabriel. Call only to Hashem. Okay, 12th century Rambam. You guys have heard of the Rambam. 13 principles of faith. One of them, 5th principle, pray only to God, not to anyone or anything else. This was a Jewish innovation. The idea that any person could pray directly to God, as opposed to having to go to a medium or what are the people, like the oracles, right? This is a Jewish innovation. And for us to then say, I'm not going to pray directly to God, but rather I'm going to be praying through an intermediary, is somewhat contrary to this belief. At the same time, I must say that there are Talmudic sources, for example, Brachot 18a, Chullin 7b, that suggest that tzaddikim are even greater in death than they were in life, which suggests perhaps some of the origins of the spread of this custom. The Zohar also okays, by the way, direct address of the dead and asking them to pray for you. Next subject, which is, and this one is going to be a little bit more difficult, but it's possible, that perhaps we shouldn't even visit cemeteries at all, even for our own relatives. Okay? Rambam Avel again, 4:4 says straight up, one should not visit graves. That's what it says. The Igeret HaGra from the Vilna Gaon. Remember, the Vilna Gaon, by the way, is a very interesting figure for our discussion because he's both a halachist and a Kabbalist and a philosopher. Yes?
Does Rambam say after how much time you shouldn't visit? Because somebody told me years ago...
He's not talking with, there. He's not specifically addressing your relatives. He's talking about burial customs in general.
Because somebody told me, and I can't remember specifics, but if somebody hasn't been visited in 25, 30 years, you shouldn't start bothering them. And then somebody's been dead 60 or whatever years, you should...
I haven't heard it. It's interesting.
Leave them alone.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't heard it.
So it could be...
Aleph?
How does Rambam's brother die? Does anyone know?
His brother.
At sea. He dies.
At sea?
He drowns.
Yes, his brother doesn't have a grave.
What about his parents,
I don't
though?
want to imbue psychological...
What about Mr. Maimon?
He was very upset by his brother's death.
No, he was very upset, but it's interesting that his brother doesn't have a grave. He's also
I don't think that at this point what the Rambam is saying is for relatives.
Oh, okay.
Okay, as I said, I think he's talking about general practices. He simply says one shouldn't visit graves. I think that means as a general practice. I don't think that he would be, although we'll get to later ones, I don't believe that he would say that you shouldn't go to your parents' graves or something like that.
Joel, just one other thing.
Yes.
You mentioned that in Christianity there was a culture of visiting graves and that may have influenced the Jews in Christian lands.
Yes.
The Jews in Muslim lands, what's the kind of dominant cultural thing on graves.
We actually see it more now among Sephardim, I think, than among Ashkenazim. I don't know at what point it enters. It's a good question. I'll have to research. I don't know at what point it becomes widespread in the Jews of Mizrach and of Sfarad. But I think nowadays one sees a much bigger culture of it among Sephardim and Mizrahi Jews.
But it's one of the Rambam living in.
It's a good question. I don't know. It's a good question. So the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, who, as I said, is a halachist and a Kabbalist, he writes a letter that I'll say before I even read what he says that this I don't believe was meant to be a halachic psak. This was a letter of musar that was aimed specifically at women, and there are other things in it that we probably wouldn't be very happy with, and so you might not want to follow it. But still, is worth noting that he says, this is a quote from the Igeret HaGra, refrain also from going to the cemetery, especially women, as it leads to all kinds of sorrow and sin. He also says in the letter that women should pray at home instead of going to shul because they'll get jealous of people's clothes and things like that. So I'm not sure that we necessarily want to follow this, but I just want to explain though that the idea exists though that he is saying,
Now it all
and
comes
as
together.
I'm repeating, this was not a halachic statement, but I think it's important to note that he's saying that there's an idea of refraining from going to a cemetery.
Was this one?
Vilna Gaon. But speaking of the Vilna Gaon, we see references here, and we're talking, I'll give you two references. First from Rav Schechter when he writes in Nefesh HaRav, and also from Rav Soloveitchik in Halakhic Man. So, Nefesh HaRav, Rav Schechter is writing about Rav Soloveitchik. And he says, it is the custom of the family of our Rav, Rav Soloveitchik, and then in parentheses he writes, according to the opinion of the Gra, which is the Vilna Gaon, not to go to a cemetery to visit our fathers' graves. So it should not appear, chas v'shalom, like Dorish Elametim. So he says, even for our parents' graves, we don't go to the cemetery. And taking it in more detail of who it's quoting, who are the people, in Halakhic Man, Rav Soloveitchik writes, the Gaon of Vilna, so that's the rabbinic forebear of the Soloveitchik dynasty, not the physical forebear. Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, the founder of this, his son Rav Chaim, his grandson Rav Moses, Rav Eliah Pruzna, who is Rav Soloveitchik's maternal grandfather, never visited cemeteries and never prostrated themselves on the graves of their ancestors. The memory of death would have distracted them from their intensive efforts to study the Torah. So according to him, all of these Rabbanim in this mainstream Ashkenazi dynasty did not go to graves. I don't know if this is true historically, but this is what he says. And lastly, I was reading an article in the Jerusalem Post by Rabbi Shlomo Brody, who's a teacher, I think, at Hakota, and he mentions, I tried to track him down to get the source, I don't have the source, but he mentions both the Vilna Gaon and Rav Azriel Hildesheimer, who was a rabbi in Germany, that they were against visiting graves even on yurt sites because cemeteries are impure and can lead to inappropriate worship. So I'm not saying that none of us should go to graves, even especially on the yard sites of our parents. I'm just saying that there is an opinion out there that is within the mainstream view of the rabbinate that this is something that we should at least think about. And what of this inappropriate worship that it might lead to? Does it really happen? Well, let me give you a number of examples of this. Okay? Historical examples. Starting in the year 910. There was a guy named Sachal ben Matzliach. He was a Karaite from Jerusalem, and he writes that he saw people going to the grave of Rav Yossi Aglili and taking wax from the candles that people burnt on the grave and rubbing it on their bodies, women, so that they would have babies.
Does it work?
I don't know, he doesn't specify. This is similar to other customs that have been criticized by many people later on, of taking dirt from a grave, or ashes from the fires of the Hilula, the yard site ceremonies, or water from the cave of Hillel HaZaken and Meron for healing purposes. All of these things, I believe, may find their roots, believe it or not, in the Talmud. Because in Sanhedrin 47b, it says that people took earth from the grave of Rav and put it on their body when fever was beginning to combat this. And Shmuel says that this is permissible. And uses specific reasons why it's okay. But I think the idea that, first of all, the fact that he says it's permissible shows there was actually a question about whether it was permissible. And it's very specific. Regardless, this is showing some of where this has gone. Let's move to the 16th century. Radbaz, David ibn Zimra, he has to criticize Jews who are actually opening up graves so that they can have better contact with the dead inside. Okay? Let's go to the 19th century. You have a shadar, a fundraiser for the community who goes to Arbil, which is in what is today Iraq, and it's a drought. And he finds the people, the common people, outside of a grave, blowing shofar and actually offering sacrifices at the graveside. And we know this because he goes to the Ben Ish Chai, the Rav Yosef Chaim who's in Baghdad, and tells him about it, and the Ben Ish Chai issues an edict, says this is completely forbidden, of course, and he forbids it, but the fact that this is what it led to, people were doing this. Okay? And so I think that this shows, another one also, a small one I think, is you may have seen, you ever go to a kever tzaddik and see rags on the trees, or sometimes nowadays even plastic bags and stuff like that. So this is a tradition where people will take pieces of their own clothes or the clothes of sick people, tie it onto the tree near the grave, so it'll sort of be blessed by it, and they come back and they'll actually wear it as like an ornament of some kind, or not an ornament,
What's a good
Amulet.
amulet. Thank you. That's what I was looking for. By the way, this is an Arab practice as well. It's not clear to me which direction the influence was, if it came from them to us or us to them, but it is a practice among many Arab peoples as well. My point here is that perhaps some of these don't fall under the heading of inappropriate worship. I don't know. I would believe that at least some of these are inappropriate according to Jewish beliefs, and I think you can decide for yourself where the line is between legitimate Jewish worship and where it borders on superstition, sorcery, or avodah zarah, potentially.
So Rambam acknowledged that there are all kinds of other powers out there.
Mm-hmm.
He said very specifically we're not supposed to use them.
Okay.
We're not denying these exist, but we're not supposed to use them.
Right. I don't think that he would believe that the souls, the neshamot of holy Jewish people are those other powers. I think those are...
But trying to channel those powers.
Perhaps. I think that perhaps you may be right in that. I wouldn't want to say that that's what he had in mind, but potentially, yes.
Right, well, the intention is to try to use some power other than delving straight to Hashem.
Yeah. Potentially.
I think actually Rambam would think that all of this is foolishness, and you're not going to accomplish anything by using other powers, but it's still forbidden.
Right.
I want to offer one final potential issue, which is different than the other ones we've discussed, which is a specific issue of, you may hear people deciding they want to leave Eretz Yisrael to go to a holy grave. Perhaps Uman, or perhaps others, but Uman is the most common one. And there's a halakhic question about, can you leave Eretz Yisrael to go to visit one of these graves? Now, I believe that most of us probably do not follow this halakha, but there is an idea that one shouldn't leave Eretz Yisrael at all except to do a mitzvah. Okay, that's the official view. I know many of us might leave for vacation, but that's the official view. And so Rav Shlomo Avinar is a modern rabbi. He says that officially, since you can only leave Eretz Yisrael to do a mitzvah, going to pray at a kever tzaddik, as much as it may help you in some way, is not a mitzvah. You can pray here, you can pray there, and of course he says, even if it is something that puts you in the right frame of mind, no matter how great these rabbanim are, the avot and imahot who are here in Israel are greater. Doesn't matter how great they are, the avot and imahot are greater. So if you're going to go pray there because you can't say, oh, I'm going there to mitzvah to go pray there, go here and pray, is what he says. And therefore he says, you're not allowed to leave to go to pray at a kever tzaddik outside of Eretz Yisrael. And just showing how sometimes people obsess on these things and they get a little crazy. Rav Dov Lior tells the story about how crazy it sometimes gets, that he talks about people going to the kever Rashbi, kever Rav Shimon Bar Yochai Miron, to pray. What are they praying for? They're praying for help that they should be able to get to Uman and ask Rav. So summing up the potential problem segment here. Potentially there are problems of addressing the dead based on Dor Shalametim. Also, praying in cemeteries is problematic. One may not be allowed to enter a cemetery at all. Philosophically, I believe this perpetuates a focus on death rather than on life. And it also encourages prayer via intermediaries instead of directly to Hashem. It can lead to inappropriate or potentially asur practices among those who don't know what they're doing. And finally, there may also be halakhic issues if you're leaving Israel to visit such graves. Let me get to the last main section, which is the practicality aspects. Let's say you still want to go and visit a kever tzaddik, and as I said, that's great. Are these graves accurate? Are they the people that we think we're going to? Many ancient graves in Israel have late traditions as to who's buried there, very late traditions. So how could whoever identified them possibly know that this is the grave of whoever they say is there? And or many of them are actually problematic based on either the geography of the site or the archaeology of the site or the location of the site, things like that. There's a famous joke many of you may have heard. If you heard it, don't ruin it, but it's a joke that relates to this. There's a tour guide leading a group of people on a bus, and they're driving along, and he points out the window and he says, over there is the kever of Shmuel Hanavi, of Samuel the prophet. And everyone takes their pictures, and the bus rides on. The next day they're in a totally different part of the country, and he points out the window and goes, over there is the grave of Shmuel Hanavi, Samuel the prophet. And everyone starts taking their pictures until one guy says, wait a second, you told us yesterday that that was the grave of Shmuel the prophet. He says, oh yeah, of course, Shmuel Alef, Shmuel Bet. Thank you. Let's discuss some of the specific graves in Israel and how accurate they may or may not be. Let's start with the, no pun intended, granddaddy of them all, which is Maharam Machpelah. Maharam Machpelah, the building above it, according to most scholars, is a Herodian era building that means 2,000 years old, which is a very long tradition. It is also in a very logical placement, that if Abraham were living in Hebron, that is most probably where he would have been buried if he were burying outside of Hebron. There is an ancient burial cave from the Middle Bronze style beneath Kever Rachel, beneath Maharam Machpelah. And yet, one must still remember, pardon?
When is the Bronze Age?
The Middle Bronze Age is the time that Abraham lived. I'm saying it is the correct time period for Abraham, that's what I was saying. And yet one must still remember that if the tradition begins in the Herodian period, and we don't know that it began then, but remember that the earliest reference we have is from 2,000 years ago, that's still more than 1,500 years after Abraham died. Can we say with certainty that this tradition was passed down accurately for 1,500 years? So what I would say is that of all of them, this is amongst our best traditions and most logical, and therefore it's a highly plausible site and logical, but even then we can't say with certainty that this is their grave, but of all of them that's probably our best. Similar but not quite as good as Kever Yosef in Shechem.
Did they do excavations?
So we haven't done excavations, but do you remember the year that they went in? Was it 1970 or so, was it?
Yeah.
Or earlier?
It was just after 67. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the late 60s, early 70s, there's a place that's sealed up that people actually went down into. They sent a smaller child in and went in and he described what he saw and everything. I think also an archaeologist accompanied him, if I'm not mistaken.
It was a little girl.
Yeah.
It was a girl.
I forget all the details. Robin here can tell you in greater detail, but people have gone in and have found underneath, not an excavation, but they did find the style of burial cave that we know archaeologically is appropriate for that time period.
But the tradition of Rabbi Leibel Valley Sorim is very different.
Also, it's a double cave, that's the other thing.
Right.
The word Machpelah meaning two caves, so it's a double cave.
There's also, by the way, interestingly, there's also later burials that were done there. People that probably wanted to be buried near the cave of the patriarch, so they find later burials also underneath the Machpelah. Anyway, Kever Yosef is similar but not quite as good. It's a tradition of about 16 to 1700 years, and it's also the logical placement according to the biblical account. Let's talk about Kever Rachel, though, which is probably the most common one that any of us probably go to, even more than Maharam Machpelah for practical reasons these days. And there's actually many problems with identifying Kever Rachel with Kever Rachel according to the biblical account. I can get into more detail later if anybody wants, without getting into too much detail. Based on Psukim in Yirmiyahu and Shmuel Alef, it seems clear that the Kever of Rachel should be within the area of the tribe of Binyamin, which is to the north of Jerusalem. And Beit Lechem is in the area of the tribe of Yehudah, which is to the south of Yerushalayim, and thus it is problematic. In fact, there is a place in the area of Binyamin that some speculate might be it because it has an old Arabic name, Kuber Bani Israel, which means the graves of Bnei Israel, and it's some sort of ancient buildings that haven't really been dated, and it's in an appropriate location, and there's other reasons. So some speculate maybe that was Kever Rachel, who knows. But regardless, where it is problematic. By the Middle Ages, however, this has become widespread as accepted as this is the spot of Kever Rachel. And what's interesting, similar to the story I told you before about the Shach, and why he said that it was mutar, it wasn't Yerushalmi because everybody does it. So the Ramban, before he comes to Israel, writes about how problematic it is. This can't be Kever Rachel because it should be in Binyamin, and this is not in Binyamin. And then he comes to Israel, And after visiting and seeing how everyone venerates it, he revises his view. He says it must be the place because otherwise everybody wouldn't be saying it's the place. And so he revises his view. So regardless, there is problems identifying Kever Rachel. How about Kever David HaMelech in Mount Zion? Definitely not Kever David. Okay? Assuming that David existed, otherwise it certainly isn't, but assuming he did, according to the biblical account, he is buried inside of Ir David. Ir David was not there at the time. It hadn't expanded west onto the western hill where Mount Zion is today. It was outside the city, and therefore, if the biblical account says that he was buried in the city, he couldn't be buried where Kever David is today. How does this tradition start? Well, the Christians who have above it, if you go there now, you have the room of the Last Supper, traditionally, is located on the second or one floor up, and the ground floor is Kever David in the same building. For many reasons, and in many places, the Christians want to connect Jesus with David, because Jesus, being the Messiah in Christian tradition, needs to be descended from David. It's one of the reasons, perhaps, why, according to the New Testament, he's born in Bethlehem, where David is born. It's also why you have the Tower of David, which has nothing to do with David, because it's close to the Holy Sepulchre. Okay? So for another reason, they would want to have this in the same building. Of course, they don't necessarily understand how this would be problematic. Jesus, being a religious Jew, which is essentially what he was, would not be having a meal in a building that was built over a kever of a Jew, for two more reasons. But this is probably where the tradition begins. Definitely is not David, though. There are those who speculated, I don't believe this is the case, but there are those who speculate that in fact, maybe no one is buried there at all. And I always joke that that might even be better to go pray there than to be praying at the wrong place, right? If there's nobody buried there, you don't have any problems, right? Just an interesting side note story. How many of you have seen the Second Temple era model of Jerusalem at the Israel Museum? Most of you seen it? So that was done with a lot of scholarly input, a lot of scholarly knowledge, and there's also been things that have been changed when they discovered things that were inaccurate. And if you look at it, you will see Kever David marked in the area of Mount Zion. And he, the person who built it, knew that this was not Kever David. So why did he put it there? When it was built before 1967. I think it was 64, if I'm not mistaken, that it was built. And the Green Line separated Jerusalem, and the old city was on the Jordanian-controlled side. But Mount Zion and Kever David were under Israeli control. So the idea was that if he were to say the one thing of any Jewish connection that we can find here that we actually have control over actually isn't really accurate, there would have been uproar. And so he just said, I know that this is wrong, but I'm putting it in there because this is part of our modern Jewish culture, modern Israeli culture. It's important to support this.
There's a story that in one of his exams, in Chagiga, Yolan gave his students, he asked a question, give me 10 examples of mistakes that I made in my model.
Ah, nice. But some of them were corrected later. Some of them were not, like that one, and also the theater that's in Jerusalem is wrong. But anyway, okay, so that's Kever David. What about many of these modern 20th century traditions? You have Kever Dan, right by Tzomet Shimshon. You have Kever Matityahu and the Kivrei Maccabim near Modi'in Eli. You have Kever Shimshon and Manoach at the top of the hill, also near Tzomet Shimshon. All of these are modern 20th century interpretations. Many of them have no logical way that they would be able to identify them. Most of them are what were called a Kever Sheikh, that there was an Arabic tomb there of some important person, and they just said this is a tomb of a famous... Bye. Nice to see you. Thanks for coming. A tomb of an important person, and that somehow this tradition became adopted, that it was an older person, that thus we then re-identify them as holy Jews. By the way, not all are inaccurate, okay? For example, Kever Rambam in Tveria is most probably accurate. Of course, many of the more modern rabbinical traditions, like you were saying, like, Bal Yisurim, whatever, probably are accurately who they say they are. But we get back to the original issue of, are these people that we should be going to? So once again, Marat Machpelah and the Avot may be the exception, although Rachel is still problematic, and others may be largely bogus.
So what about the rabbis of the Talmud, or the ones that you visited the north?
So it depends. I think some of them are at least logical placement, may have long traditions. Some of them, if I'm not mistaken, I have to relook at the list. I think many of them are among those that they are re-identified. And so if you believe the Ari could accurately identify the time, if you believe that he couldn't, then that's that. All right, so this brings me then to sort of the bottom line. It's a long bottom line, but I'll try to sum up everything. So, as I see it, this is a custom that in its origin is not Jewish, and even within the normative Jewish practice, once it has begun, it has drastically grown and changed from its earliest expression. It may have been originally acceptable with the avot and with relatives, and somehow it's grown to include virtually any person who is considered holy. There are many philosophical issues with this practice, and at least potential halakhic problems with it. And to top it all off, many of the graves that people visit might not even be holding the bodies of the people they think they're praying to, or praying next to. So what else might we do instead of going to pray at the Kivrei Tzadikim? Well, let's start again with Rav Shlomo Avinar, the one who was talking about leaving Eretz Yisrael to go to Kivrei Tzadikim. And he says, even here in Israel, instead of going to Kivrei Tzadikim, it's better to do righteous deeds, good deeds, like Avraham, or learn Torah, which connects us with Moshe, or alternatively, instead of spending lots of money on a flight to Oman, you could take that money and give it to Tzedkah. He said, things like Tzedkah and mitzvot and Torah are things that have clear benefits, according to Jewish beliefs, and things like praying at the kever of a tzaddik has unclear benefits. He's not saying it's no benefit whatsoever, but clear benefits versus unclear benefits.
But these are group activities. I mean, people like...
Do you need to participate in that group?
Well, people...
That's your choice.
You know, the thousands who go to Uman.
Agreed.
They need that.
Agreed, and that goes back to what I said before, that it's the combination, I think, of the veneration of the Rebbe, but also the idea that people are looking for spirituality. I think we need to find that spirituality in other places. But I agree that clearly what we see there is that there's a void that needs filling. I agree with you 100%. I just don't believe that this is the proper way to be filling it, personally. Rav Yosef Shalom Eliashiv, not Zionist rabbi, a Haredi rabbi, and he says, go pray at the Kotel instead. Okay? That's more of a holy place. And Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, this isn't necessarily about what we can do instead, but it's a nice thing, a nice story I heard about him, where he would walk from his home to his yeshiva, and he would pass by Har Herzl. When we would pass Har Herzl, he would see the graves of the military cemetery, and he would say, these are the real Kivrei Tzadikim. I don't think that means that he's not saying the others are tzaddikim or are holy. But I think he's perhaps is somewhat downplaying this veneration of the Kivrei Tzadikim, maybe. And by the way, notice he makes the comment from outside. I don't know if he went into graves, but he does make the comment from outside. And my view personally, and this is my view as a tour guide, is since we're a people that places a greater value on life than on death, let's go to the places where these people lived and talk about them or learn about them or pray there if you want. You want to say Tehillim, right? You're in Tzfat. Why would you go to the cemetery of Tzfat and go to the Rav Yosef Karo's grave and to the Ari's grave when you can go to Rav Yosef Karo's shul and the Ari's shul, right? Why would you go to Marat HaMachpelah when you can be near the Temple Mount where Akedat Yitzchak took place, right? Okay, Rambam, maybe you can go to Egypt, okay, easily, okay, where he lived, but many of these great people, we can actually go to where they lived and do the same things. Let's do that and venerate their life instead of remembering them in death. If where they're buried is holy, then certainly where they lived is holy. Regardless, the custom has clearly become widespread, and many times people accept things, and that's fine. And Judaism does believe somewhat in the holiness of place, like the Temple Mount, for example. One of the things that I often say as a tour when I go to the Western Wall, and I talk about the fact that there's nothing inherently holy about the Western Wall. In fact, the Temple Mount's holier, and it's a piece of engineering. It's a retaining wall. But what I remind people is that for 2,000 years, Jews have been going there and praying and crying, and that 2,000 years of Jewish prayers and tears gives a certain holiness to the place. And so I think the same can be said for the Kfarim or Kfarot that have long traditions. Maybe not these ones in 20th century traditions, but that these grave sites, like Kever Rachel, for example, is still a holy place for that reason alone, perhaps. So what I would say is that if you decide that you are going to go to a Kever Tzaddik to pray because you have halachic opinions to rely on, pardon?
Or you got a phone call.
Or you got a phone call. Then
No, they just want the money.
I would say at least at least be careful about not addressing the dead directly, as this might be Dorish Elamitim, and praying directly to God. But this will be sort of the last bit, which is more so, is there anything else, even if you go to those graves, is there anything else we could do rather than pray? And I'd like to remind us that the verb to pray in Hebrew is l'hitpalel, which is a reflexive verb. We don't pray to God because we want to do something to God. We pray to God to do something to ourselves. It puts us in a certain frame of mind. In Gemara Taanit 16a, it discusses that there was a practice on a fast day to visit a cemetery. It doesn't talk about praying in a cemetery, but visiting a cemetery. And one of the reasons given is to remind us that before God we are like the dead, to teach us humility. Admittedly, the other reason is so that the dead will intercede on our behalf. Okay, but it doesn't say anything else about praying to them for it. But I think the idea that we can take a visit there as a lesson to ourselves, and thus another way that we can use a visit to a grave of these people as a way of improving ourselves is to learn the teachings of these people, or to hear the stories of their lives or the things that they did, and to turn them into examples for us to live by. If you go to the kever of Rav Yehuda HaNasi in Beit Sha'arim, it's in a big burial cave, and above the cave, outside, there's a big area for seating. This is what's called a yeshiva. Okay? The idea of yeshiva, you have Rambam Avel again in 1425. He says, we convene a yeshiva at the dead's grave for 7 days, as is said in Divrei HaYamim Bet. They honored Chizkiah in death. Our sages interpret this as meaning they convened a yeshiva at his grave. What does that mean? That means that you would go to the grave of a person after they died and you would learn Torah there. Not pray there, but learn Torah there. And this brings me to end with something that Kalev mentioned, I think it was in passing, maybe it was Robin who mentioned in passing, Yerushalmi Shekalim 2.5. It says, Rav Shimon ben Gamliel says that we do not, it was Warren, I'm sorry, he said we do not place tombstones on Kivrei Chachamim. This may have been, I believe, as a desire to avoid pilgrimage, sort of like with Moshe Rabbeinu. And by the way, Rav Yehuda Nasi at Beit Sharim does not have a tombstone. He's buried directly in the earth with no covering, no tombstone, no marker, no nothing. So perhaps he is following this. But why is the reason that Rav Shimon Gamliel says we don't put tombstones on the Kivrei Chachamim? Because their teachings serve as their remembrance. And so I think that if we're going to go there, learn something that they wrote, learn something that they did, and let them be an example for us. Thank you. If anybody has questions, I'm happy to answer if I can. But thank you. Yes,
The people who go, what do they do? The people who do think it's...
I say, what don't they do? I think there's as many people as go have different practices. Some people go and say Tehillim. Some people go and daven to Hashem for their personal things, not like in a formal prayer, but they'll do that. I think some people have minyanim. I don't know about in a cemetery, but I mean, you go to Rabbi Meir Balanese and you have, or Marat Machpelah, and you have minyanim there, which to me, I don't know how they do that within Arba Amot. I hope that they're more than Arba Amot away. But I think everybody does something different. Some people go there and light a candle. Some people go there and just contemplate. I think that many people, and you can ask the audience, since most of the people here have gone, ask them what they do. What did you do? You've been. What do you do?
Oh, just to look at what the other people were doing.
So you can laugh at them, right?
I really don't. What do the sources say? Like the Hasidic sources that advocate this, what do they say is happening?
I haven't read specifics of what one should do. I've read things about going and saying one may pray there. And one may even address the tzaddik to pray on their behalf.
Okay.
That I've seen. Beyond that, I haven't seen like a prescription of this is the order of things you're supposed to do. But what you will often see is that specific graves get their own segula. Like if this is, you're looking for a spouse, then you go to Amuka, right? And if you're looking for this, you go there. And if you're looking for this, you go there. How does this get started? I don't know, but there are certainly some traditions of that as well.
Well, there do seem to be, I kind of collect the flyers, and I send them to somebody in England who's doing doctoral dissertation, Lindsay, doctoral dissertation on sort of modern kind of external practices. But they do seem to have rituals. Part of what they are asking you to fund is people who have, like the Kabbalists have a ritual that they perform, and I don't know if they're open about it.
You're talking specifically at graves, or you mean in general Kabbalists?
Zero, but a lot of it is most of them are centered around graves.
By the way, you remind me of something that I meant to put in that I forgot. So before I forget, let me just add one thing that I think also may have in part led to some of this growth, which is when the Jews of Eretz Yisrael were living on the Chalukah, that means that they were sending people overseas to raise money from Jews overseas to support Jews in Eretz Yisrael. If I'm not mistaken, the first one that was really raising overseas was Rameir Balanes, that they sent these boxes saying, the Jews of Tiberia, we need to build a building around the kever of Rameir Balanes, and this spread to many others. And I think that some of these Kibbutz Tzaddikim, some may have been tied to that idea as well. Maybe. Maybe some monetary aspect.
Rameir Balanes was known for supporting the Talmidei Chachamim in Eretz Yisrael. That's what they were originally.
Right, but I'm saying, but they specifically were sending out people saying, give money so that we can build a building around the kever of Rabbi Meir Balanes.
In addition.
Right.
No, isn't like the sheet for the art site of Rachel, which by the way also the date of the art site may be wrong, but like there's the red string, but like the red string that you will get has been properly performed, whatever that means.
Right. As opposed to just being a red string somebody bought in the store.
Or like the Amuka, that the Kabbalists will come and they daven there, I don't know if it's every day or once a week, and they've got certain prayers.
So if I understand what you're saying is that within some of these places that there's a specific, for lack of a better term, a specific recipe that those in the know perform at each of these places? Is that what you're saying?
That's what it's.
I think that's probably true, yeah. Yes, Nadia.
First, my question was actually connected to the red string, which is I just happened to go to some healer guy in the shuk, and I was wearing this red thread from the kotel or something, and he says, pull it off immediately. It's like, it's superstition is a load of rubbish.
He's wanting to marry.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on that, but the little knowledge I have is this, and this is a little knowledge. The origins that I remember, at least, the first I ever heard of it was, as I think what Warren was saying, was that it originally was people used to wrap this red string around Kever Rachel specifically, and that was the only place that did it, and they would give out pieces of this string. I don't know what the specific segula was for, if it was for something specific or it was in general. And then it spread to like general good luck charm for everything, as I can see it. Like, when you have all these people at the Kabbalah Center in LA getting it, I don't think they have any idea about Kever Rachel. I think they're just, this is associated with this mystical concept of luck. I think that's how it's transformed in the last 20 to 25 years.
And the second thing that I think Robin might be able to answer, because he's an expert on death, was that Olam Haba wasn't originally Jewish, correct? Because you were talking about that there was no such thing as Olam Haba.
No, I didn't say it wasn't Jewish. I said it wasn't in
the Tanakh.
It's not in Tanakh, obviously, except right at the end.
Well, there's Sha'ol in Tanakh.
There's Sha'ol, but it's not Olam Haba. It's a grave.
Paradise.
No, Sha'ol's not a paradise. Sha'ol is a hell beneath.
For some people, it's paradise.
No, I'm just wondering how, if in the Tanakh there wasn't the next world, then how are these people going to be praying for us?
It's a good question. I mean, I think that it all comes into
the latest
how this
sources
changed.
already have Olam Haba. So, the people who wrote the story of Kalev praying at the grave already have
Correct.
Olam Haba.
Correct.
Of course, just to be fair, those people, the tradition would say that one must believe that one can find Olam Haba hinted to in Tanakh.
Right.
It's also like explicit, like when you have Shmuel, for example, who after he died, he tells Shaul, "Umachar ata uvanecha imadim." Like, I'm right now in the next world, you will live with me.
You're saying it's implied.
Well, he's down beneath.
It's more than implied.
But no, he's down beneath him. He comes out of the ground. He's not.
Right.
Okay, but that's the next world. I don't know what it is, but it's.
He's not in that Aiden from the story.
I didn't say Gan Eden. I said like another the world beyond.
We lost.
Anyway,
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Joel. And thank you, Elliot.
Thank you, Elliot.
Thank you, Elliot.
And thank you, Yona. And thank you, everybody, for coming. And 10 shekels plus however much you want to donate to the MS
Society of Israel.
Joel has got to go to Super Bowl party.
Not right away, no.
But I think that we should also organise a special tour of any graves in Israel. But Joel is our tour guide, finding the real Kever Rachel, going to Amukah, but not praying there, but learning and giving tzedakah. Anyway, it's just an idea for.
I think it's a lovely idea. We should all be zocheh to find our bashert that way.
Oh my.
Oh my.
Now that the camera's off.
Yes.